We're going to talk about Johann Gutenberg and the invention of printing with movable types, which he's supposed to have invented himself. Metal printing type in the West hasn't really changed very much. These are certainly among the oldest types in Britain, and they were bought in about 1670, not made at the University Press, Oxford, but that's where they ended up. And they look much like surviving metal types today. A bit rougher, rubbed to get bits left behind by the casting. And as you can see, the one second from the left isn't really very perfect. That doesn't necessarily matter as long as the face with the letter on it is okay. Well, the odd flaw didn't really matter very much. Here is metal type that I set, the 4 lines above, and the 4 lines below are my printing from it. I've put them upside down above because that's the way they look in the composing stick when you set them, and you read them from left to right, and upside down, and make sure that you've got all the right letters in place. So there's a piece of modern type, but cast from quite early matrices that are at the University Press at Oxford. The making of type is quite a complicated business, and I'm not going to go into enormous detail here. If you want to see it done, I would recommend a series of quite short clips on YouTube, which you can get to with the 2 names at the bottom, Stan Nelson and Atelier Press. He has made type and indeed demonstrated printing at one of the major American museums, and he now makes type and indeed the molds for casting them at home. The quality of his videos is pretty good. Here, for example, is one of the punches he's cut. Having been finished, he wants to harden it, which means heating it to red heat and plunging it into cold water. This is one bit of technology I'm not going to explain in detail, but it took me some time to learn it. If you harden steel, which you can do by heating it and putting it in water, it'll be very hard, but it'll also be pretty brittle, as Joseph Moxon says here, and very subject to break. Therefore, you need to temper it. Tempering is to, as he says, let it down. So you have a very hard piece of steel, the punch, and you need to just relax that hardening. It's quite a tricky process, and Stan shows it quite nicely, so I won't try and explain it here. But there we are. The punch itself is a block of, I won't say soft steel, but hasn't been hardened, and so you can work on it. In this image you've got a way of working on it with a file, not shown here, but to make a an impression in the top of the punch, you can use what he calls a counter punch, because what you're making here is the third one along, which is the counter punch, which has an image of the hollow bits of a letter H. Stamp that into the punch blank, which is the fourth one along, and you get the hollows ready-made. A simple file will then enable you to open it out and make the H that we see here. I won't try and go into more detail, but I will show this image, which I think is one of the clearest I know and nicest. There is your finished punch on the left. You stamp it into a block of copper, which is a softer metal, and third one along, it bulges naturally. You've stamped the punch into it, and the really important part of the process is to then tidy up what is now the matrix, not matrix by the way, matrix, so that it will fit into the mould. And finally, at the far end, you've got the type that is cast in the mould. Matrices, or matrices, are very long-lasting, and that has a lot to do with the history of type, because in this particular case, you have matrices for type that was in use in the 1490s. So they may be more or less 500 years old. We'll see a closer-up version of them in a moment, but even here you can see they're pretty sharp. They've lasted 500 years and used gently, they're good for another 500, I'm sure. But what do you use to make the type? This is one of the quite tricky bits of metallurgy. Type is mostly lead, which melts at a fairly low temperature, and you can hold the mould that you cast it in your hand, which you wouldn't dare to do with many metals. So mostly lead. But antimony is a very important addition. Antimony added to lead not only makes it harder and makes, as I say here, sharp casts. Lead tends to give you rather sort of rounded edges. The antimony makes a better version of what's in the matrix. But it has another quality. When it is heated, it shrinks. When it cools, it expands. Now that's not what most metals do, but a metal made up of lead and antimony doesn't either expand or shrink significantly. Makes a very accurate cast. Tin is another good thing to add. Tin, as I say, flows, and it helps again to make a good impression, a good version of the matrix. Copper, iron, well, maybe the odd trace, but that isn't important. And at the bottom I've put a note on two kinds of metal. If you have a linotype machine, casting type for a one-only use, and when it was invented it was for one edition of a newspaper, you don't need that much antimony, and you can have a lot of lead, which certainly reduces the price. Founder's metal, type founder's metal, is much harder and intended to be kept for a long time, and as you see it has much more antimony, but that's all I'll say about type metal. A whole lot was going on in the later Middle Ages, all of which comes into printing and using metal type. paper, obviously, got into Christendom, into Europe, very gradually, but from about 1200 it was actually being made in certainly in Spain and Italy. What is printing ink? Well, it's really what we would think of as varnish, which you make by heating or boiling some oils, not all of them. Linseed is good and walnut, but other oils are no good at all. The point is that they dry quite independently of being exposed to oxygen. And in the case of printing ink, you want a black ink. So you add soot, not too difficult to make. They're really oil paint. And this kind of paint for pictures began to be made about 1400. The press, well, that's easy enough. That was already a device being used for oil or grapes for making wine. Lastly, punches made of steel were actually in use from about 1400 for making inscriptions on seals or indeed coins. So that was another technology already around. Who invented printing and where? Well, where is a bit of a puzzle. A claim was made that in the Netherlands a man called Coster invented the process, but although we've got plenty of quite old books, there's no documentation that proves anything. France has documents about a man called Waldvogel, who seems to have made metal punches, but where are his books? We haven't got them. Italy got into the whole business by claiming on behalf of a man who did in fact print, Castaldi, that he invented the process. But we haven't got any books or any documents that back it up. Germany has, in this little phrase that I'm showing here, it has books and now the document in question relates always to a certain Johann Gutenberg. He was born in Mainz. He came from a well-off family, but he wasn't a goldsmith, as people often tell you. On the other hand, he did get involved in metalwork, not in Mainz, which he had to leave, but in Strasbourg. He was a part of a kind of company, a partnership, in the 1430s. There's really no evidence that he invented printing there, but he was certainly involved in metalwork. The partnership broke up after a rather stressful disagreement, but all the documents go a long way to avoid telling you exactly what they did. Anyway, he came back to Mainz. In the 1450s, we know that he borrowed quite a lot of money from Johann Fust, and that it was to do with what was called the art of the books. Well, maybe funding his exercises in type founding. And from the 1450s, we have actual documents, printed things, among which, of course, the 42-line Bible, which we'll look at in a moment, is the most famous, a big book. But there were also smaller things too. I've put at the bottom the name of a couple of books, which I find useful. Bechtel, I think, is very good. It's in French, but it's one of the most up-to-date summaries of what we do know. Kapr wrote in German, and this English translation was published in the 1980s. Both of them useful texts. One of the problems about talking about how types were made is that in 2000, two people slightly unsettled our ideas. Blaise Aguirre y Algas was a graduate scholar at Princeton University, and the librarian of the Scheide Library in Princeton, Paul Needham, is an acknowledged expert on early printed books. What they said was that Gutenberg had a method of making type that didn't depend on punches and matrices. Their ideas are quite complicated. And this Open University television program didn't actually go into the detail completely. And as you see at the bottom, Paul and Blaise were trying to say exactly what went on. They want to set about proving it before naming names. Well, they've never got round to naming names, so I'm afraid that's not something we can go into. But this is one image that Blaise made by shining light through the paper of the big 42-line Bible. And if you look at the bottom of that letter A, the angular part of the letter seems to be made with a separate diamond shape, which is separate from the rest of the punch. Is it? Maybe. Something very odd is going on here, and I'm not going to try and explain it. Except to say that there are other ways of making type without a matrix. You can make a little, say, version of a type by carving wood, and you can use the wood to make up impressions in sand, and as this image shows, you can cast type in sand. The only trouble is that when you cast it, the sand has to be knocked away, and to set it all up takes forever. So although it can certainly be done, and Aguirre and Needham thought this was one of the possible ways that Gutenberg might have used, no one takes it seriously. So making the punch and the matrix remain the favourite methods. Here is a punch cutter at work with a graver. I mentioned files, which are very important. And this particular punch cutter has a lot of files, you can see at the edge of this image. But Nelly Gable, who has just written a book about what she has done in her career at the Imprimerie Nationale, here she's using a graver, or burin, to engrave out the hollow part of the steel. Well, that's important too, and as I say, she's written about it, and you can read her book. If you've made a letter on your steel punch, you want to know what you've done, and you can make a proof of it, not with ink, which wouldn't do it any good, but you can put soot at the end of the punch by holding it over a lamp or a candle and make an impression, which is really quite effective. And that's the way professional punch cutters do it. So here we have, as I promised, a close-up of one of those early matrices. And as you see, they're pretty sharp after 500 years, and certainly capable of casting good type. What you do to cast type with, I'll leave to Stan Nelson to demonstrate in his video. But here is a mould on the right-hand side, which was actually made for Giambattista Bodoni in Parma in Italy. And Stan Nelson and I went there, and we took one of Bodoni's moulds, and one of his matrices, that letter B in copper, is a Bodoni matrix, and the ladle is what you pick the molten type metal with and pour it into the mould. And that actually was made by Stan himself. So there you are. I'm not going to go any further into the technique. The result depends how well you've cast the type and how good you are at printing. I'm not saying this is good printing, but it's certainly about as early as anything we know. Probably the mid-1450s. Not perfect, but not too bad as well. And it's a type which had quite a long life. If we're in the 1450s here, it was certainly used for printing a Bible. Not the 42-line one, but it has 36 lines in the column, and it probably was made round about 1460. And the actual quality of the casting is a whole lot better. There's a detail. Look at a detail of that page I've just shown, and as you can see, the actual quality of the letters and their alignment is a very great deal better. The big Bible of Gutenberg is normally thought to be this one, 42 lines in the column, so about a 20-point type. And here's one in the United States in the Library of Congress, and this is from a scan which was made on a CD, which is not bad, and it's fine until you try and see detail. I've picked out one line here in the middle of that column, Populus Dere, from the book of Leviticus. The trouble is it tends to break up if you try to see this digital scan. Here's a rather better scan of the same column, and you can see this in an online version of the Bible, which is online from the State Library in Munich. Pretty good. But if we want to see that line in more detail, why not have a look at a photograph made directly from it? Which is what I was able to do, not from the book, by the way, but from a single leaf that had come loose from the book. And there it is in an English library, which has the great advantage of giving you a very flat surface. The advantage of this image is that you can see the detail of what is going on. Here, for example, you have that word faciem. The F overlaps the A. It's kerned, as a type founder would say. That's quite tricky technology, but all later metal type did it to some extent. The C and the I seem to be joined. They're not, but the C has been made flat so that it abuts onto the I. Well, the effect here in that word faciem is to give you almost completely even aligning of the vertical strokes. that actually makes the page look beautifully even. So quite tricky technology, developed pretty rapidly. As for the way of actually getting that C to a butt onto the I, when you cast type, it reflects the conical profile of the punch. It has to be conical or you'd never get the punch out of the matrix when you struck it. But here it is. When you cast it, the profile of the punch overlaps the edge of the type, and you need to rub it away and get a nice snug alignment. Gutenberg had a lot of type, a lot of different characters, because he had the idea that professional scribes had, that quite a lot of letters needed to be joined together. So maybe you've got as many as well over 200 characters to make up the font. The technology got better very fast indeed, and this is one of the most perfect early printed books. We know when it was printed because the date 1457 is in it. Moreover, the names of the printers are there. Johann Fust, well, he paid for it. Peter Schoeffer was a calligrapher, and for a while we know he was the partner of Johann Gutenberg, and maybe the art director of the operation. So where was Gutenberg? We don't know. There was some kind of separation, but his name is not in any book at all. But the quality is amazing. This is a big type for this book of Psalms, about 40 point, and it has these amazing two-colour initials, which are very, very perfect. Getting the register of red and blue here was achieved probably by making the two parts separately and fitting them together so that there's no overlap of one colour on another. Well, very beautifully done, very slow and hugely expensive. Printers did not go on doing this, but they certainly did it in 1457. Here's a much simpler printing job, and again, we know the date. In fact, it's the earliest date we find in any piece of printing. It's one of these indulgences which you could buy from the church and get a kind of diminishing of your punishment for your life. A great cause of quarrelling with other religious believers who became known as Protestants, but the Catholic Church made a lot of its funding from these indulgences, and that's a simple piece of paper. The date, by the way, is added in handwriting as a sort of guarantee of the genuineness, but it's small type. In fact, and this is the big puzzle which I shall leave you with, there are two indulgences, same text but different type, both dated 1454. The Textura Gothic, saying Forma on the left, is from the 42-line Bible. The Forma on the right is the type of the 36-line Bible. Who printed them? Gutenberg? Was there another printer? But the important thing from our point of view is these are small types, 13 and 14 point. However they were made, really it's difficult to think that any process but the punch and the matrix could be used.